an American man over 50 journeys deep into the Mongolian steppes, encounters a tribe, and is astonishingly asked by three sisters to impregnate them to continue their lineage. David Miller, an American man over 50, had worked in the finance department of a rather successful mid-sized company. However, his marriage David Miller had long since broken down, and he had endured many hardships in Lefionde. He wrapped up his business, deciding to travel the world before it was too late. He had few family ties, and the fact that he had never truly left the United States further spurred him on after his divorce. His heart was complicated and bewildered, but at 50 years old, he finally packed his bags and embarked on a journey abroad. Initially, he had considered Southeast Asia or Europe, but suddenly the Mongolian steppes he'd seen in a documentary clearly came to mind. Their horizons stretched endlessly, and people still led nomadic lives. And untouched wild civilization, David Miller wanted to immerse himself in that landscape. He wanted to feel freedom in a strange land. An acquaintance told him that, besides urban areas, Mongolia had vast grasslands, deserts, and rugged terrain, making travel very difficult. Over the more he heard, the stronger his curiosity grew. He happened to meet a Mongolian language translator in an online community, who informed him that in the western and northwestern regions there were still some minority tribes with almost no contact with the outside world. Upon arriving in Ulan Bator, David Miller slowly began to move westward. He rented a car for his use and learned some basic Mongolian greetings from a translator and dictionary he had prepared in the United States. He anticipated that English proficiency would be low, but he believed there would always be a way to manage. After touring Ulaanbaatar and nearby small towns for a few days, he ventured into more remote areas. As he moved further from the city, the roads became increasingly dilapidated, and his cell phone signal vanished. However, David Miller felt more relief than anxiety. It seemed as though the bustling life in the United States, the wounds from his divorce, and the judging eyes of others had all disappeared. No, it was just him and the vast expanse of land. After driving for several hours in unpaved roads, a desolate landscape suddenly unfolded. Strong winds howled, swirled, and there were no signs of villages, except for some dimly visible ridges in the distance. He had brought a certain amount of food, water, and vehicle fuel, but he didn't know when or where a village would appear. A slight fear crept in that he might be isolated in the heart of the steppes. However, from the moment he left, he knew it was a dangerous journey. Wolves or wild dogs roaming the steppes, unpredictable weather, a science of getting lost. None of it was easy. David Miller opened his map again and the car, trying to find a place where a known landmark might appear, but he had even lost his sense of accurate positioning. Confused by the rugged terrain on this desolate plain, where even a fallen needle would be hard to find, he decided to trust his intuition and continue. One afternoon, after driving for another half day, he saw what appeared to be small dots in the distance. Upon closer inspection, it seemed to be a small settlement of several yurts. David Miller was exhausted from the hot sun, but seeing this sight, he felt a wave of relief. If this was a cluster of yurts inhabited by Mongolian nomads, he could at least find people, water, and a place to sleep. As he drove closer, he saw a bouchet yurts scattered around. Goats and sheep grazed nearby, and people glanced at him. David Miller slowly got out of the car and greeted them in clumsy Mongolian. He tried to greet them in English, hoping it would be understood, but the reaction was a bit awkward. It wasn't an atmosphere of outright repulsion towards stranger. Several people approached and gestured for him to join them that evening through clumsy communication. Indicated he was American and traveling, the villagers seemed surprised and offered him roasted lamb and milk tea. David Miller was very grateful and clumsily expressed his goodwill by giving them some American snacks and small souvenirs he carried. This village was a very small tribe. They called themselves Jalan, and said they had long lived a nomadic life centered in this region. David Miller couldn't understand the details, but he roughly gathered their situation through a mix of Mongolian, a few English words, and their gesturettes. There were almost no young men in the village. Mostly children, middle-aged and elderly women, and elders. That night, as he slept in one of the yurts, he wondered, why are there no young men? They might have left for the cities to find work, or there could be the three sisters' reasons. David Miller simply let it be without any particular suspicion. Hestel planned to stay for a day or two and then leave the next morning, the Volligers. Him around the village, but David Miller declined. They then gestured to him the well and animal grazing areas, though without fully verbalizing it. Then in front of Phone Yurt, he discovered 3 young women he hadn't expected. They all appeared Tobe. In their early 20s, much younger than David Miller. They looked very similar, but each exuded a different charm. The first had thick black hair half tied up and appeared tall and serene. The second had brown hair, an impressively bright smile, and seemed very lively. The third had neat braids and quietly exchanged lenses later. He learned these 3 were sisters named Zhao Gala Aun and Nerona respectively. A middle-aged woman in the village seemed to be introducing David Miller to the sisters when David Miller greeted them. The 3 sisters looked at him with curious expressions and smiled notably. The second sister, Oyun, blurted out a short English hello, to which David Miller replied, "Hello, nice to meet you." Eliciting a burst of laughter. It seemed English wouldn't be fully understood, but basic greetings were fine. He naturally had the opportunity to converse with the sisters. Jalgala spoke the most. No English, making translation difficult, but Yun helped out. She had briefly visited Ulaanbaatar in her childhood and had some exposure to English. The third sister, Naren, was shy and spoke little, but she looked at David Miller as one would a stranger. That afternoon, David Miller visited the nearby pastures with the sisters. They also watched the villagers herd livestock across the steppes. Oyun explained the village life in simple English. She mentioned the scarcity of men that most young men had. Leffen gradually told him about the village's Anzian traditions. David Miller was curious. "So how do you marry and have children?" Oyun replied with a subtle expression and a smile. "Our tribe has a special custom. Sometimes we have relations with foreign men to procreate. The details are hard. Tokes Plainyala also whispered to her in Mongolian beside her, then gave David Miller a shy smile. At that moment, David Miller felt a chill. There's a custom of David Miller felt a chill. Having relations with foreign men and bearing children, and here were 3 sisters with almost no young men in the village. He had a ridiculous thought that they might want to ask him to do something similar. However, he just brushed it off as a joke. Could such a thing really happen originally? David Miller's plan was to stay in this village for a day or 2, then continue westward. However, the villagers showed warm hospitality, and he wanted to gather more interesting stories while gradually communicate with Oyan, so he decided to stay for a few more days, check Hisker, and stock up on supplies. Furthermore, the weather on the steppes was unpredictable, so resting for a while was also a good idea. Days passed like this. David Miller grew closer to the 3 sisters. None of the 3 were married and were the most promising young women remaining in the family. As the eldest daughter, Jogaloa is responsible for faithfully carrying out the livestock management and household chores assigned by the tribal elders. The lively Oyun was curious about external culture and city life. Soch constantly asked David Miller about the United States and looked at photos stored on his phone. The youngest, Naren, was quiet but often had on translate. With a gentle smile and a charming tone of variety, the 3 sisters invited David Miller to their yurt or around the village, had him sit beside them, and showed him various things. He watched with awe the methods of riding horses or goats, the structure inside the yurts, the process of handling firewood, and the making of traditional Mongolian food, which he experienced for the first time. Mom the Myala's meticulous guidance to David Miller was particularly impressed. As the eldest daughter, she tried to explain step by step, and David Miller grew fond of calm demeanor. One day at a casual gathering, many village women and some elders watched David Miller and burst into laughter. David Miller didn't know why, but it seemed they were talking about him. Aun, standing next to him, smiled and said, "Foreign men are precious here, especially since there are almost no young men. The villagers think you're remarkable." David Miller smiled. Oyun stated frankly. Awkwardly and nodded. However, Oyen stated frankly, "If you allow, we can hold a special ceremony in our village and have children." This left David Miller bewildered in an instant. His heart sank as he understood what this implied. Twilight was too early to make hasty assumptions. He couldn't shake the feeling that the sisters might all want them to stay and have children. A few days later, David Miller was invited to the 3 sisters' yurt. Before that, he had mainly stayed in a middle-aged couple's Yurt, but the sisters requested a long talk in their yurt that night. Yala prepared a special soup using ingredients difficult to obtain in the city. The soup, full of lamb and vegetables, tasted better than he expected, which impressed David Miller. After the meal, David Miller and the three sisters drank tea in the dimly lit yurt, engaging in a fervent conversation. Oyen was responsible for translating. The Nella looked at David Miller with a meaningful gaze and carefully opened her mouth. The following is what was roughly conveyed by An in English. This village has a very ancient family tradition, duetto. The absolute shortage of men. When an outsider comes in, he is treated with certain kindness if the man is willing. Women, such as three sisters or two sisters, will simultaneously form a relationship with him and bear children. If the man is willing, he can stay with tribe or leave regardless. The children are the responsibility of the women. In the village community, the man doesn't have to feel burdened by his children remaining in the village. Of course, if you stay because you feel responsible, the atmosphere will be better. Listening to this story, David Miller could hardly believe it, saying, does such a custom truly exist? Where some people in the world had heard that such things occasionally happened, even in some remote parts of Mongolia. But experiencing it directly, he felt it was surreal. But Jalgala added, we are three sisters, each of us lives alone, and in fact without young men. It's hard for our families to survive. I know this would be a burden for you, but it would be wonderful if we could have children together. This was indeed a bold David Miller felt embarrassed. Said proportion, not one but all three sisters wanted to have his children. David Miller felt embarrassed and thought to himself, I'm over 50, this is impossible in America. Besides, I don't know how I'd take responsibility if I actually had children. Oyen, hearing this, said, we can force you to stay. This is just an option. If you wish, you can live with user, you can leave. This is how we've always lived. He had anticipated some of it, but was still shocked to hear it. Three sisters looked at David Miller with slightly shy expressions. Noreen seemed to be quietly lowering her head. Her ears slightly reened. All three had beautiful features and healthy complexions, exuding an exotic charm when dressed in traditional Mongolian attire. It was incredible that such sisters simultaneously wanted him to father their children, and that this was a custom permitted by the village. David Miller sighed, saying, I can't. Refuse booty can't accept immediately either. This proposal is too unusual. Gala nodded and said, usual edit. Make such suggestions to foreigners. In fact, long ago, an outsider had a child this way and left, but since Ithane, no men have come for a long time, so we don't want to miss this opportunity. Owen said, don't feel burdened. If you truly don't want to, you can leave. No. David Miller hesitated and asked for some time. The three sisters understood. Please stay a while longer and consider it carefully. However, the Villagia Mar already seemed filled with anticipation, as if a foreign man had finally entered their family. He had the impression that if he stayed a few more days, a wedding would naturally take place. His heart was complex first. He went accustomed to such unconventional relationships in the conventional American way of thinking. A man marrying three sisters simultaneously was absurd. Moreover, he worried about how he would take responsibility if he actually had children. Of course, the tribe allowed men to leave, but David Miller was tormented by the thought of whether he should abandon his own children and depart. However, even if he completely refused, David Miller's own situation was a problem. Back in the United States, he had no special relationships nor stable worker wealth. If he settled here and started a new life adapting to the Mongolian lang or lifestyle, wouldn't be easy, but freely building a family on the steppes was a unique option. The three sisters were beautiful and had shown him warm hospitality. David Miller had already grown comfortable with them and secretly developed feelings for them. Dale Gala quietly visited the yurt where he was staying. It was after everyone else had fallen asleep. Jalgala seemed somewhat reserved during the day, but when she spoke quietly at night, she was surprisingly candid. She said, I know you're over 50, but that's not an issue in the village. Women have united with older men before. What we need is a healthy child to continue the family and trust in a man, David countered. Are you really okay with this? I'm old, and my body might not be as healthy as it used to be. Gala laughed and said, I don't think you're past your prime. After talking with Yala late into the night, David Miller felt his heart gradually opening among the three sisters. Yala possessed a cautious and responsible charm like an eldest daughter. If he were to live here, he also imagined building a family in cooperation with Yala in the following days. Oh, Yuno approached David Miller more actively. Oh, Yuno, who spoke English, said casually, "Yuno, leave with me, we can go to the city together. I want to go to the United States." She suddenly suggested she wavery, curious about what the United States was like. David Miller was surprised by this unexpected answer and asked, "Could you really abandon this village?" Yun smiled vaguely and said, "Jalgala will protect the village, and Nareen isn't sure yet, but I'm curious about cities and foreign lands." Naren still didn't say much, but her face would quickly reen when David Miller was nearby. Then one day, while fetching water during the day, Naren suddenly held David Miller's hand and quietly smiled when they were alone. David Miller's heart pounded and Naren softly mumbled, "I like you too." In Avery's faint and gentle voice. After all, no more specific words were exchanged. Bhutan, that moment, his whole body was filled with excitement. He felt that even without words, her feelings had been conveyed. David Miller ultimately narrowed his choices. To first, he could refuse the three sisters' request and leave. They had said that without men, it would be difficult to have children, and the family would gradually decline, but he wouldn't have to bear responsibility. Second, he could respect their customs and hold a wedding. Even if children were born afterward, the sisters and the village community would care for them, so he wouldn't need to bear the burden, of course. He could stay and live with them. Deep within him, curiosity and a strange attraction continued to grow. In his 50 years of life, he had never imagined such a thing in the United States. Such a thing would be highly illegal and publicly condemned in a marrying three sisters simultaneously was absurd, but here it was a natural custom. Moreover, the three sisters were all pure and beautiful. They were very amiable. Most importantly, David Miller himself was tired of his past work life and married life and wanted to find a new life. So perhaps this was destiny. Finally, he conveyed his intentions to the three sisters through the wedding. Jalgala, if you truly wish it, and if I am capable, I will follow that custom. Open. Hearing these words, the three sisters were overjoyed, embracing him and covering their eyes. It was as if a long-standing mission had been resolved. David Miller tried to remain calm on the surface, but his heart was pounding. The thought of what he was doing swept through his body. After that, the village elders immediately began preparations. Originally, when such a wedding was held for a family, they would share food like a simple festival, playing traditional music and dancing. This case was somewhat unusual. A man marrying three sisters simultaneously is rare, but this also meant that this family could be grandly welcomed. One day, a large bonfire was lit in the center of the steps. Elders and women representing families sat in a circle, beating drums and other percussion instruments and reciting words of congratulation. About 30 villagers gathered, and the three sisters surrounded David Miller in the center. They wore coats similar to traditional ladder, without complex decorations, but adorned with bright Mongolian-style colors. The ceremony wasn't long. The elders simply spoke a few words of congratulation. The brides bowed gently to David Miller and then circulated cups. David Miller also drank a golden beverage like the Ville's traditional wine. His stomach grew warm. People clapped their hands with joyful smiles, and the drum beats grew louder. Lamb bread and milk tea were immediately served, and like a simple feast, some people also danced. The festivities continued after sunset, and David Miller moved with the three sisters to a specially prepared yurt on one side off the village. Several people had already come here and arranged it meticulously. Had created a space large enough for the three sisters and one man to live together. David Miller, with a slightly flushed face, said, "Jalgala, from today on, you will live with us." Oyanthan smiled and said, "From now on, we are a family. Isn't that wonderful?" Naren quietly nodded, but her eyes sparkled as night deepened in moonlight, and lantern light flickered within the yurt. The three sisters sat beside David Miller one by one. A night unimaginable in his former American life. Gala, looking at him, said, "We are not greatly influenced by things like order or rules. However, you only need to be considerate of each other. I hope to have a child, but it's not compulsory." David Miller nodded with either cohabitation or vis, yet excited heart. Their cohabitation Thus began the first few days were unfamiliar and cautious, but gradually settled into a routine. The three sisters took turns spending nights with David Miller, and they also chatted together. Yala had a serious and guardian-like presence. Oyun was energetic and charming, while Naren washy, but would occasionally give him a friendly physical touch. For David Miller, Everedy was a heart-pounding one, unsure of what would happen about a month.
Ow.
Later, David began to live with the sisters and actively participate in village affairs. The sisters were mobilized to feed livestock, maintain yurts, fetch water, and harvest herbs in the mountains. He also worked alongside them in the process. He often heard people jokingly say that he was now completely their family's son-in-law. He also felt the Villagiamar trying to accept him like a brother, regardless of age. Sometimes Gala would take David Miller to the steppes to practice horseback riding. As he calmly rode a horse and galloped across the steppes, the vast land and sky seemed to merge. David Miller recalled his previous life in the United States, buried among skyscraper sand, thought it was the first time he had felt such freedom. Oyun was always smiling and often asked David Miller, "Do you have American food? Show me American pop music videos on your smartphone." Since there was no internet signal in the village, he could only show saved files. Oyun watched the videos with great interest and happily said, "I want to wear clothes like that too." David Miller said, "If I have the chance to go back to the United States, I'll definitely take you." And Oyun's eyes lit up, shouting promise. Naren remained quiet, but sometimes when she was alone with David Miller, she would become very endearing, especially when he helped with firewood or laundry. She would quietly come over and hand him a small handkerchief, saying, "Are you tired? Take a rest." Whenever this happened, David Miller felt overwhelmed. The three were different, but they all gave him care and love. One day, Gala said she had been feeling nauseous and vomiting since morning. At first he thought nothing of it, but after a day or two, she was examined by an elderly woman in the village. The result was pregnancy. Yala was shocked, as if by a bolt from the blue, but at the same time, she also showed a look of relief. Only a child was coming, according to family tradition. This was a very good thing, and in fact, Jala herself had been waiting for the time of childbirth. Yala made a loving joke to pregnancy, David Miller saying, "It seems you've sown your seeds well." David Miller was startled, thinking in shock, "Am I really going to be a father?" He thought the probability was low because of his age, but before the mysteries of nature, human calculations were futile. But this joy was short-lived, as a few days later, Oyun also complained of similar symptoms. Oyun joked with a laugh, "I wonder if I'm pregnant too." But when the elderly woman examined her, it was indeed pregnancy. He could hardly believe it. David Miller was speechless for a moment. Galgola and Oyun were confirmed pregnant, with only a half-month interval. Sisters embraced, cheering excitedly. While massaging their bellies, a family celebration erupted. The youngest, Naren, was also confirmed pregnant about a month later. Not long after, all three sisters were pregnant. In quick succession, David Miller himself could hardly believe this was possible. Although already over 50, he not only had own child, but was having children with three sisters. The sisters are truly a miracle, he said with tears in his eyes, expressing gratitude. The villagers were immersed in a festive atmosphere. It was said that 3 children were coming at once. Sathi held a feast, even preparing a cow to mark the occasion. The elders were delighted, saying it's been a long time since such a golden age. David Miller felt embarrassed by the attention of the whole world focused on him, but at the same time, he also felt proud and responsible. In the early stages of pregnancy, they all experienced morning sickness, fatigue, and dizziness. David Miller carefully looked after them. He reduced his other tasks and did his best to ensure the sisters had no difficulties with food and followed the prenatal care methods taught by the village elders. Most importantly, providing prenatal care for 3 pregnant women simultaneously in an inland village rather than a city hospital was difficult. However, this place had a long-standing knack for childbirth. Without external medical care, people were optimistic that women who had delivered children for decades could do so without any major issues. The sisters seemed filled with joy, even though they complained of some discomfort as their bellies gradually grew. They would gather every day to chat, saying, "We'll be having babies soon." Every evening, as David Miller talked with the three sisters, he felt complex emotions when he felt happy and excited. Question, am I really going to live here forever? Kept surfacing. The sister said, you don't have to stay forever, but it would be great if you could live with us for a few years after the children are born. It would be too difficult for us to manage on our own. They said honestly, Naren, Shilly said, I initially said you could leave, but actually all three of us hope you'll stay in the village. David Miller was swayed. Okay, he said, I promise not to sound sternly for now. A few more days passed, and when Yala, An, and Naren were about 4 to 5 months pregnant, a sandstorm and other natural disasters struck. The villagorts shook, and livestock were startled and ran off. The sisters had to endure the chaos in their heavy state. David Miller quickly drove, moving the goats and sheep to a safe place. Andrew moved rolling stones around the yurts, carrying out protection efforts. Thanks to this, they passed through without major damage, but the sisters were so surprised that they felt they had hovered between life and death. That night, all three embraced David Miller, murmuring, what would we do without you? David Miller comforted his sister, saying, I will protect you. I will do my best, no matter their circumstances. He cherished them even more as each of the three was carrying a child. The entire village clearly showed its dependence on him. Finally, the delivery dates approached. First, Jala felt labor pains with her full belly, and the elderly women prepared in the yurtising simple birthing methods. David Miller's hands and feet trembled nervously, but as he saw Yala struggling in immense pain, he felt the urge to do something. Fortunately, the elderly woman with decades of experience guided the entire process well, and after a few hours, the strong cry of a baby was heard. The baby was born. Yala's hair was disheveled with sweat, but she smiled faintly as she held the baby. David Miller's eyes also grew hot, and he was speechless. His memory of perhaps having experienced childbirth once in the United States resurfaced, but this was now a child born in a completely different environment with a completely different woman. He was overwhelmed by the infinitely tiny and mysterious life. A few weeks later, Yoon also gave birth to a child through a similar process. It was said that, true to her lively self-event, during labor pain she would mix in jokes like, save me, I'm dying, which made people laugh. As soon as the baby was born, she almost lost all her strength, but upon hearing the baby's krish, immediately sobered up. I can't believe this is my baby, Yoon shed tears as she caressed the baby's fingers. David Miller also watched nervous Linear B this time, and when it was all safely over his legs, almost gave out. Finally, the youngest, Noreen, gave birth to a child. The three babies were born with approximately 3 months between each birth. Noreen didn't make much noise during labor pains, as she wasn't very vocal. Instead, she held back her tears, and whenever the elderly women said, you must be more energetic, don't cry, give me strength, she quietly complied, and at a certain moment the baby came into the world. Naren embraced the baby and said, David, you did well, you're truly wonderful, and tightly squeezed Hishand. Finally, the bride successfully gave birth to each child. It was a series of births happening at different times, but all within just a few months. The village was overjoyed, reaching a fever pitch. 3 babies being born in such a short time was excellent, meaning future generations would become even more prosperous. They congratulate him, saying the family's life had grown stronger. David Miller felt the joy and responsibility of becoming a father. Honestly, it was hard to believe he was raising 3 newborns. But thanks to the sisters' unity and the village communities, helped things progress smoothly. Every morning, he would be woken by the baby's cries, but his fatigue would disappear when he saw the children adorably suckling. Now, the brides and David Miller lived in the same yurt, caring for the 3 children together. Since the babies woke up in shifts every night, the 3 sisters took turns caring for one baby, and sometimes David Miller would hug and comfort 1 or 2. This was a situation could never have imagined in the United States, but here it was common for several people to live in one yurt. Anbeck, as the entire family raised the children together, it was less difficult. Naturally, David Miller became very busy early in the morning while the sisters were feeding the babies. He would go out of the village to chop firewood or tend to the livestock. When David Miller turned, the sisters would report, "You've worked hard, our babies are doing such and such today." The village elders would occasionally come to check on the baby's health and praise David Miller, saying, He truly is a remarkable man, still working so hard at his age sometimes. Oh Yun would hum American pop songs to lull the babies to sleep. Yala, like a mature adult, would responsibly clean, even while raising the children, worrying about how to prepare clothes when they were slightly older, or how to obtain milk or formula. Naren quietly and silently watched Thebos, and at some point, she would quietly tell David Miller that she was grateful for him, embracing the family children so fully in such daily life. David Miller. He was being reborn. He had his divorce pain and stagnation from the United States and built a completely different family in a completely different place furthermore, with 3 newborns. Born carrying his seed simultaneously, he had become the center of a large family he had never imagined sometimes. He would miss civilization he'd thought of food from. Hishamland, the United States' comfortable shower facilities and internet connection, but the innocent smiles off sisters and children made the regrets disappear. Moreover, there was a fierce competition here, no worries about money, and no corporate superiors. Of course, there was difficult physical labor and the danger of natural disasters, but there was a warmth off communal living. Here, as the newborns became more stable and postpartum recovery was achieved, David Miller began seriously discussing long-term residence with his sisters now that the children were growing a bit. Shouldn't they consider city life for their education? And in other aspects, oh, Yuna actively agreed. I want to live in the city once and teach the children too. I agreed, saying, our village has no schools or hospitals, so moving to the city, or at least closer to a town, might be the right thing to do at some point. Naren also nodded slightly. However, the issues were money and legal matters, even if they only moved within Mongolia. They would have to go to Ulaanbaatar to find housing or rooms, and living expenses wouldn't be easy either. Furthermore, if David Miller was considering going back to the United States, complicated administrative procedures such as the children's birth certificates and the sisters' visa would become a problem. Jalgala said, if you're willing, I'd like to go abroad with you, but all 3 of us would have to go at the same time, and with 3 children. She shook her head. David Miller thought it wasn't the stage to make a decision. At first, let's let the children do better here and discuss in detail again when they're a bit older and can travel, and go back to the United States to prepare a certain amount of money, or I can first live in a Mongolian city. He suggested the sisters' freedom. All agreed with this viewpoint. The village elders also said, if raising their children becomes inconvenient for you, you can leave for the city on your own. We wish for you to stay, but we respect your freedom. David Miller was somewhat moved by these words, and on the other hand, he also felt apologetic. Even if he were to leave one day, would they be okay? However, they seemed adaptable, as they had long experienced situations where outside men came in and only left behind children. Ultimately, David Miller, the brides, and the newborns lived as one large family under one roof, continuing the village's communal life. When the babies were about 1 year old, it was noisy and bustling, but David Miller felt happy seeing the sisters take turns caring for them. Here was a peaceful family harmony he couldn't have achieved in the United States. These days, he would sometimes drive an SUV to areas near the city, or at least find a hospital in town to get them vaccinated. Each time the 3 sisters' family and 3 children accompanied him, the car was crowded at the hospital. The doctor smiled and said, oh, a father having 3 newborns at once, that's truly amazing. David Miller's language wasn't very fluent, but he could communicate roughly because the sisters would translate. Thus, he gradually interacted with external civilization. Even in the village with 3 babies born, there was much energy. Adults were very satisfied, remarking that after a long time the house was finally filled with the cries of children. David Miller had also reached a stage where he didn't hesitate to exchange drinks and jokes with several people in the village. He was no longer a traveler who stayed for only a few days and left. He felt he was now a true member. Sometimes at night he would build a fire in front of the yurt and gaze at the stars, thinking, how did my life unfold this way? I simultaneously gained the freedom I so yearned for, and new love and responsibilities, even in strong winds with the brides beside him. The yurt where the children slept felt like a sanctuary that couldn't be exchanged for anything in the world. The noisy and complex civilization seemed long forgotten, and the Mongolian land and wind embraced him. Sometimes he felt disheartened because he had no place to return to, but now, at least in this Plessis, had 3 wives and 3 children, a family, when he thought of this. His heart rolled warm, and he felt a new sense of responsibility and hope. This family would continue for decades until the children grew up, and this inland region would care for them. In the inland regions of Mongolia, the seasons flow harshly in winter temperatures can drop to tens of degrees below zero, and in summer heat and sandstorms strike nomad shave, adapted and live within these conditions. Similarly, David Miller, his 3 sisters and their children might face many trials in the future. The children might fall ill, financial deflets might arise, or natural disasters might occur, but they would overcome it hand in the name of family, and by uniting with the customs and community spirit of this Mongolian tribe. Now a newborn cried in the yurt, and the sisters busily comforted him while David Miller also got up to help when Oh Yun called out, "I'll hold you today. So go comfort Naren's baby," Yala said. "I'll prepare the meal." Their appearance was somehow chaotic, but it was a warm and ordinary daily life of a family there. A family dynamic completely different from Thenarmal framework in the United States existed. Yet it was filled with sincerity, caring for and cherishing each other more than anyone else. Life continued thus deep in Mongolia's bandless steppes. The sun set, and at night glittering stars covered the entire sky. Benefit in a yurt lit by a small lamp resided a man in his 50s, who had once been trapped in isolation, and his brides who formed the family he now had to protect. Now there were also 3 infants who had just come into this world. This family, which seemed strange at first glance, had actually transformed into a precious relationship for each other. The ending remained uncertain. This family might experience many stories and choices, but one thing David Miller realized: life is only once, and if you can achieve love and unity in any way, that is enough to be worthwhile. His encounter with the 3 sisters brought him the freedom he had been seeking, in another form of responsibility. This was enough to change his life thereafter. As a result, an unconventional relationship that began with a foreigner's visit ultimately brought new vitality to inland Mongolia. The sisters each successfully continued their family line by bearing children, and the villagers also blessed them. David Miller was also considered a member of the village and gradually took root in this land. One day, even if the children grew up and left to explore the wider world, the dedication formed on the steps in the yurt and with his new family would never change. Perhaps one day, David Miller would take the children to the United States. At that time, P.O. player and them might be surprised, saying, "Impossible, a man with 3 sisters and children, but isn't life always an unpredictable adventure?" At this moment, stars twinkled over the steps, and the yurt was filled with warmth and the laughter of family. Thank you for watching today.